It is really a great pleasure and a privilege to have a conversation this evening with John Lewis, a legend in the civil rights movement, member of Congress from Atlanta for now almost 3 decades, often referred to as the conscience of the Congress, a recipient of our nation's highest civil honor, the Medal of Freedom. I want to give special thanks to Bonnie and Tom McCloskey, who make this series possible. Congressman Lewis has just written an absolutely remarkable book. It's actually a trilogy, and he'll be available to sign copies of it afterwards. Book 1 is called March. His co-author is here, and I'd like to recognize his co-author, Andrew Aiden. Andrew, would you please stand up? This is a graphic and beautifully illustrated trilogy that combines personal memoir, history, and lessons in morality. It's destined to be a classic for teens and young people. And frankly, it's a heck of a read for anybody, and I strongly recommend it. And interestingly, and we'll talk about this a little bit, it takes the form of a comic book, and it's beautifully, beautifully illustrated. It's received already extraordinary recognition. It's won the Robert F. Kennedy Award, the Coretta Scott King Author Award from the American Library Association. Washington Post said it should be in every school and every library in the United States. It's also, interestingly, because of its format, up for all kinds of awards as a comic book. It's up for 3 Eisner Awards and 3 Harvey Awards. The Eisners, I guess, are the Oscars of comic books, and the Harveys must be the Golden Globes. And it's been on New York Times bestseller list for 32 weeks, and I can't imagine there's ever been a book about the civil rights movement that's had anything like that. And you know, one other thing, we actually have a meeting going on here on our campus this week with people from all over the country discussing the Common Core in public education in the United States. And it's perhaps the ideal book for the Common Core with respect to civil rights, and I'm sure it's going to be recognized as that. You all who are here in the Greenwall tent with us tonight have a biography. Most of you, of course, know a little bit about Congressman Lewis, already seen tonight. Many of you are lucky to have him as your congressman from Atlanta. But there are many more people who are listening and watching this both tonight and will be in the future. So let me just take a minute before I engage in a conversation with him, and then I'll open it up to all of you, just to remind all of you a little bit about this remarkable man. John Robert Lewis was born in 1940. His father was a sharecropper, and they lived on 110 acres of cotton, of corn, and peanuts in a rural corner of the deeply segregated South, a corner of Alabama. At that time, of course, when he began school, it was before Brown against Board of Education. Brown was decided when he was just 14, but of course Brown had no effect on his own schooling. A year after Brown was decided, he heard a sermon on the radio, I think it was a radio station from Montgomery, as I remember reading, by someone he'd never heard of named Martin Luther King. And then he learned about the Montgomery bus boycott, and these activities inspired a life of activism. In 1957, he left Alabama to attend the American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville, where he became a leader in the efforts to desegregate the lunch counters in Nashville. He was arrested there, the first of many times. He went on to participate as a freedom rider in 1961. He chaired the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he helped with a march on Washington in 1963, and he actually, at that march, was the youngest speaker. After that march, the Civil Rights Act, 50 years ago, became law. But like Brown against Board of Education, effects of that legislation took some time to actually have effect. In March of 1965, John Lewis was a leader of the March on Selma. After crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were attacked by state troopers. He was severely beaten, and indeed his skull was fractured. The images of this and his personal entreaties to President Johnson sped the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He got involved in politics in 1981. He was elected to Congress in 1986, and ever since he has continued to devote his attention and his extraordinary passion and power to issues of civil rights, to human dignity, to health care for all, and to public education. I mentioned some of the highlights of his life and the early civil rights period for a reason that I think was probably a motivating factor as well for him to write this book. And that is simply that for people, frankly, much younger than I am, who did not grow up during the 60s and weren't shaped by the 60s, the events in that seminal decade are barely understood. And even for those of us who did live through them, the memory is fading and the significance isn't as great as it should be. So I think it's very, very important to be to remember and be reminded about these events, and there's probably no one who can do that more effectively. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about your history, a little bit about your book, and then a little bit about contemporary issues. Let's start a little with something about your own history. One of the things that's fascinating about this book is the amount of time that's devoted to your life as a very young boy, living on a farm, raising chickens, your experiences in your little rural community, your experiences with your family, for example, driving from your rural home to Buffalo, New York, and what you experienced on the way. Why and how was your early childhood such an important influence in your life as an activist?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted and really very pleased to be here, to see so many wonderful people, to see some of my old friends, to see Sam Brown here and his lovely wife. We work together, to be here with my co-author, Andrew Iden, to be here, this beautiful place. You know, I could live here.
Well, we'll have you back as much as you'd like.
But thank you very much. Now, it is true that I did grow up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. It is true that my father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. We still own that land today in rural Alabama, 10 miles from Troy, 50 miles from Montgomery. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton and corn and peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. And it was my responsibility on the farm to care for the chickens. And I fell in love with raising chickens like no one else could raise chickens. I really did. And as a matter of fact, last weekend I was back there on that farm for a family reunion. And one of my grandnephew, I guess, is raising some chicken for the 4-H club that he's a part of. And it delighted me so much. But as a little boy growing up there, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like each and every one of you are gathered here. And my brothers and sisters and cousins would line the outside of the chicken yard, but they would help make up the audience, the congregation. And I would start speaking, preaching, and when I look back on it, some of these chickens would bow their heads, some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. And, and as a matter of fact, some of those chicken was just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. Growing up there, when we would visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, visit Birmingham, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, white waiting, colored waiting. To go downtown to the theater on a Saturday, all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony. All of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. And I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents why. They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But in 1955, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard about Rosa Parks. I heard Dr. King on that old radio, and the words of Dr. King inspired me to find a way to get in the way. I was so inspired by Dr. King that in 1956, at the age of 16, with some of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we went down to the public library, trying to get library card, trying to check out some books. And we were told by the librarian that the library was for whites only and not for coloreds. I never went back to the Pike County Public Library in Troy, Alabama, until July 5th, 1998, for a book signing of my book, Walking with the Wind. And hundreds of blacks and white citizens showed up. End of the program, they gave me a library card. I think it says something about the distance we've come and the progress we've made. But I remember taking that trip to Buffalo much earlier.
Yeah, you talk about that in this, and I think it would be hard for so many of our children today to appreciate the challenges you faced and your family just driving through the states you did to get to Buffalo.
Well, we left rural Alabama, traveling from Troy to Montgomery to Birmingham, through Tennessee, through Kentucky, and we really couldn't make a stop for food, a rest stop, until we got to Ohio. I remember much earlier, before we left, my mother and her sister, my aunt, stayed up late at night preparing food, cooking pies, cakes, frying chicken, putting in shoe boxes.
So you had to bring the food with you.
Oh, yes. We didn't have aluminum foil and had brown wrapping paper, wax paper, so we could have something to eat along the way.
So you mentioned Reverend King and how you first heard him on the radio, and of course you had a very extensive relationship with him after that. Just tell us about him and why he had such power and influence, and why he inspired you in the way he did.
Was just listen to Martin Luther King Jr. on the old radio. I felt like he was speaking directly to me. Like he was saying, John Robert Lewis, you too can do something. You can make a contribution. So when I finished high school in May of 1957, I wanted to attend a little school 10 miles from my home. It was called Troy State College, now known as Troy University. Submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, didn't tell my teachers. And he wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery. In the meantime, I'd been accepted at a little college in Nashville, Tennessee. So I boarded a Greyhound bus.
And Troy, of course, wouldn't accept black students.
Troy did not, at that time, accept black students. So I went off to school to Nashville. I remember it so well, September 1957, 17 years old. An uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, more money than I ever had, gave me one of these big trunk, a Foot Locker, the one that you could open up and bring back together, had the drawers, the curtains, where you can hang some of your clothes. I put everything that I owned except those chickens in that Foot Locker and went off to Nashville. And after being in Nashville for about 3 weeks, I told one of my teachers that I'd been in contact with Dr. King. And this teacher informed Dr. King that I was in Nashville. They had studied together at a school in Atlanta. So Dr. King got back in church and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So in March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, my father drove me to the Greyhound bus station. I boarded the bus, traveled the 50 miles from Troy to Montgomery, and a young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray, who was a lawyer for Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and the Montgomery movement, and later became our lawyer during this freedom ride in the march from Selma to Montgomery, met me and drove me to the First Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy in downtown Montgomery. He ushered me in. I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind a desk. I was so scared. I didn't know what to say or what to do. And Dr. King said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And from that moment on, I knew I could not turn back. It was something about the man, his presence, what he said, and the way he said it inspired me. When you listen to Martin Luther King Jr., you had to move. You had to be committed and become dedicated to a cause, to a movement.
Well, we'll come back to your time in Nashville, but I have to ask you, given all of that, how did you feel when you heard that he was assassinated? And what did you think that would do to the civil rights movement?
When I heard that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, campaigning with Robert Kennedy. And I had heard that Dr. King had been shot, but I didn't know that he had been assassinated. He just had been shot. And I would happen to organize this rally for Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy came in and spoke, and he made the announcement that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. And I just felt weak and in disbelief, and I cried, and like so many others in that audience. And I had what I call an executive session with myself for a moment. I said, well, we still have Bobby. And 2 months later, he was gone.
Nashville and the lunch counters, a seminal episode in the civil rights movement, and you were a leader of that. Nonviolent protest. What lessons did you learn in terms of what it means to be a leader and what it means to affect social change from your early days in Nashville?
Well, I discovered in Nashville, attending the nonviolent workshop, the training, that you have to be prepared, be willing, committed. If you're going to lead, you must be a headlight and not a tail light. But during those days, some members of the media press would walk up and say, "Are you one of the leaders? Are you one of the spokesperson?" Or I would only say, "I'm just one of the participants." But I literally grew up when I was sitting on those lunch counter stools. We studied the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. We studied what Gandhi attempted to do in South Africa, what he attempted to accomplish there. We studied what he accomplished in India. We studied Thoreau and civil disobedience. We studied the great religions of the world. We studied what Dr. King was all about in Montgomery. And many of us in Nashville grew to accept the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence as a way of life, as a way of living, not simply as a technique or as a tactic. So when someone would come up and spit on us, or put a lighted cigarette out in our hair, or down our backs, pour hot water, hot coffee on us, or pull us off the lunch counter stool, we didn't strike back. We adhered to the way of love, the way of peace, the way of nonviolence. I remember so well, like it was yesterday, when we heard that on a particular day that we may be arrested. I wanted, in Nashville, the movement was so disciplined. Dr. King would come to Nashville and said it was the most disciplined movement of the local movement. because we had a great teacher there by the name of Jim Lawson, who had traveled to India. He was part of the Methodist Student Movement. He had studied Gandhi. He was a pacifist, and later became a student at Vanderbilt University. We wanted to be dressed in an orderly fashion. We wanted to look good. And I wanted a new suit, and I couldn't afford it. Most of the young people in Nashville would put on ties. The young ladies would put on stockings and heels. It was the whole image that we were trying to project. So I went downtown Nashville to a used men's store and bought a new suit. And this suit cost $5. And my young co-author a few weeks ago located the photograph and blew it up. And I tell you, I was looking sharp in that suit.
I bet you were.
And so I went to jail with a sense of pride and with a sense of dignity.
And with a nice suit.
And for me, it was a new suit. I said to someone the other day, if I still had that suit, I probably could sell it on eBay.
It'd be a very valuable suit. Let's talk about the Edmund Pettus Bridge for a minute and Selma and what that was like. You talk about the challenge to remain peaceful in the face of indignity and violence. Just tell us what it was like. You're crossing the bridge, and then what happened?
Well, on Sunday, March 7, 1965, 600 of us, men, women, and children, left church, came out into a parking lot where we conducted a nonviolent workshop, saying that we would walk in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion from Selma to Montgomery, that we would not block traffic or interfere in any way with traffic. We would walk on the sidewalk across that bridge. I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. In this backpack, I had 2 books. I thought we were going to be arrested and that we were going to go to jail. I wanted to have something to read. Had 1 apple and 1 orange. I wanted to have something to eat. And since I thought we would be in jail with my friends, my colleagues, and my neighbors, I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. So I had toothpaste and toothbrush. We got to the edge of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A young man from Dr. King's organization named Jose Williams said to me, "John, can you swim?" He saw all of this water down in the Alabama River. I said, "No. What about you?" He said, "Yes, a little." I said, "We cannot jump. We got to cross this bridge, and we must march from Selma to Montgomery." We get to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And behind the state troopers on horseback, we saw Sheriff Clark posse. Sheriff Jim Clark was a very mean man. He wore a gun on one side, a nightstick on the other side. He carried an electric cap router in his hand, and he didn't use it on cows. He wore a button on his left lapel that said, "Never." He had requested that all white men over the age of 21 to meet the night before to stop the march. So we just walked and came within hearing distance of the state troopers and the sheriff posse. And a man spoke up and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. It would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your homes or to your church." And Jose Williams said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these guys putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, bull whips, tramping us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. Almost 50 years later, I cannot recall how I made it back across that bridge, but apparently someone carried me back to the church I do recall being back at the church. The church is full to capacity, more than 1,500 or 2,000 people on that side trying to get in to protest what had happened. And someone said, John says something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desires to register to vote. And the next thing I knew, I had been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma, where a group of nuns took care of us. They were the Sisters of St. Joseph. And many of these nuns today are retired in Rochester, New York. But if it hadn't been for these sisters, I don't know what would have happened to many of us.
Well, you can see why it's so important that stories like that still get told. And of course, the Voting Rights Act was signed after that. Let me ask you a different kind of question, and that relates to protest and what can be effective. There are lots of revolutions around the world today. There's lots of injustice, and many people talk about and worry about whether protests can be effective just through social media or signing online petitions or tweeting. You, when you were on that bridge with everyone else, you had skin in the game. I mean, you put your life on the line.
I gave a little blood.
You gave some blood. This was not passive resistance. Do you see a problem with the lack of willingness to put people's lives on the line, put their safety at risk in protesting issues? Do you have concerns about whether social media kind of protest can ever replace the kinds of protests that you engaged in as a young man?
I think social media is important to help reach hundreds, thousands, and millions of people, help educate and sensitize people. But it's not anything more powerful, as Dr. King would say, than the marching feet of a determined people. When people bodies, and it doesn't matter whether they're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American, when people moving together in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, you can appeal to the conscience of all humankind. And that's what makes Selma so beautiful. A few days after Bloody Sunday, hundreds and thousands of people, religious leaders, priests, rabbis, nuns, educators, history teachers, college professors, came from all across America, and it changed America. There was demonstration in more than 80 major cities in America. There were nonviolent protests at the White House, the Department of Justice, on almost every college campus, every state, at American embassies abroad. That is powerful. But we didn't know anything about a website.
You had no options.
No, that's right. We didn't have a cellular telephone. We didn't have a fax machine. We had old mimeograph signature.
In a minute, I want to come to some contemporary issues, but before that, let me just ask why you and Andrew chose to do this in a comic book fashion. I mean, it's one of the most profoundly significant movements in American history through a comic book. Why?
Well, for several reasons, but the most important reason, we wanted to reach another generation of people, especially young people, to understand what happened and how it happened, that they too can make a contribution. You can have words, but when you make those words come alive, I think it holds the attention of children, young adults, and people my age and older. You see action. In this book, you see action. In book 2, the cover is going to be the burning of the bus.
In book 2 is going to be the burning of the bus. Is going to be the cover.
And just think,
The
in
image of
1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born, in 1961, black people and white people couldn't be seated together on a Greyhound bus, leaving Washington, D.C., to travel through Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, on our way to New Orleans. That was drama. And people were beaten. People almost died on that bus in Anniston, Alabama, between Atlanta and Birmingham.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that for children today, young people today, just the very fact that in our very recent history, you could not get on a bus in Washington, D.C. as a black person and cross the Potomac River. So what kind of reaction are you getting on your book tour as you're talking about this?
Well, it's been amazing. It's been amazing. Andrew Iden would tell you that the copy of the book went to a very prominent reporter at a prominent newspaper. I won't call the reporter's name, won't name the newspaper. And the reporter called and said, I don't usually do anything like this, but I just want you to know that I passed your book on to my 9-year-old son. Now he's going upstairs, dressed up in his Sunday's best, put on a cap, marching around my house, saying he's marching for equality. Children and adults are reading it. Teachers are teaching the book. Several colleges and universities adopted the book as required reading for all freshmen in school in late August.
I think I heard that there are 15,000 students who are going to have this as a required book. And there had never been so quickly a book that has been recommended for college students, and it is part of a curricula.
Well, it's amazing to me, and I'm traveling to different places, and every so often I get a chance to travel to Europe, and the young people, the students, they're so informed. They know Diane Nash's name, the young lady who was the chair of the student movement in Nashville. These young people, they keep up with what happened. And it's important for American students to know what happened, how it happened, that they too can use the way of peace, the way of nonviolence, the way of love to make our country and our world a better place. And sometimes I think, even in the Congress, we make the book available to every member of Congress. I think we need to conduct some nonviolent workshops there.
I mean, just the image of you I've never been to a comic book convention, but the notion that you're there presenting at a comic book convention, where they're presenting Spider-Man here and John Lewis here, but my understanding is that people were camping out at the convention just to be able to get into your session, that it was so popular.
Well,
what's going on
here? Well, some
here?
people kept on walking up saying, and I hate to put it this way, but you're the real hero. You're the real Superman. And I told Andrew that when I go back next year, I'm going to dress with my trench coat, and I'm going to have my backpack, and I'm going to play myself.
All right, I said we were going to come to some contemporary issues, and we are celebrating some anniversaries, with the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. And you think about it, Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, perhaps the two most significant pieces of legislation that had the greatest effect in American history. Yet let me bring you to what was a tweet of yours heard around the country. And it was just weeks ago. You said, if the Civil Rights Act was before Congress today, it would not pass. It would probably never make it off the floor for a vote. Really?
I believe that. I believe that. It's a different climate in Washington today. It's a different environment today. Back in 1964, 1963, President Kennedy made one of the major speeches on the whole question of civil rights. He said it was a moral issue. The speech he delivered on June 11, 1963. President Johnson picked up where President Kennedy left off. I remember so well the day of the March on Washington. When the march was all over, President Kennedy invited each one of us, the 10 speakers, back to the Oval Office. And he stood in the door greeting each one of us. And he kept saying, "You did a good job, you did a good job." He was beaming like a proud father. And when he got to Dr. King, he said, "And you had a dream." President Lyndon Johnson picked up and got that legislation passed almost as a living memorial to President Kennedy. And there was Democrats and Republicans. If you visit my congressional office in Washington, you'll see me standing with Senator Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate. From Illinois. There was Democrats and Republicans working together for the common good. Maybe, just maybe, we can get all of this, whatever has happened in the psyche of America, out of us.
Let's talk about voting rights. The Shelby County case was decided last year, which struck down the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Given what you had done, given the arrests, the bodily injury, fighting for voting rights, marching for voting rights, what was your reaction when that Supreme Court decision came down?
When the decision came down in June last year, I wanted to cry. I felt saddened that so many people gave everything they had. I kept thinking about the 3 civil rights workers: Andy Goodman, Micah Sherner, James Chaney. Kept thinking about the people who stood in those unmovable lines trying to pass a so-called literacy test. Back in the 50s and in the 60s, people were told they could not read or write well enough. Some people were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. And I kept saying to myself, these guys, all of the women voted right, and one man voted right. But I said, these guys that are...
You're talking about the members of the Supreme Court.
Members of the Supreme Court. I said, they never stood in an unmovable line. They never have been required to pass a so-called literacy test.
Let's just talk about voting rights issues. And I mean, these are now, there's legislation in many states in the country now dealing with voter ID, getting rid of early voting, requiring other kinds of evidence to vote in the name of voter fraud. And I recently saw the Brennan Center issued a statement saying that you're more likely to get struck by lightning or see a UFO than actually find an actual incident of voter fraud. What's going on here? Why isn't voting easy and simple and convenient?
Well, my philosophy and my view is the vote is precious. It's almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society. And it should be easy. It should be accessible. I think there's a deliberate, systematic effort in our country, and it's not just a Southern thing, to make it harder and more difficult for people to participate. We should open up the process and let people come in. Someone said the other day, being able to register or being able to cast a vote should be as easy as getting a glass of clean water. Make it simple.
We've talked about anniversaries of important issues, Supreme Court cases. Brown against Board of Education. Schools are segregated today. Our public education system, particularly for blacks and many poor people, especially in urban areas, is not good relatively to many other countries in the world. What's happened since Brown?
Well, we made progress, but we're not there yet. We still have a great distance to go in America before we lay down the burden of discrimination in education. We got to work and pull together at the local level, the state level, and the federal level and make it happen. It's in the best interest of our society, of an educated electorate. We have to do it.
What are the most important elements that need to happen?
The federal government, along with state and local, need to make the resources available. It's important that all of our children, all of our young people receive the best possible education. We just do it.
Healthcare. You've been fighting ever since you've been in Congress for healthcare for everyone. Is the Affordable Care Act working?
Well, I think the Affordable Care Act is working. It's not perfect, but it's working, and we will get there. Healthcare is a right, and it's not a privilege. We all should have quality, good healthcare. It must be accessible and affordable for everybody in America.
Explain what's going on in many states. I think Georgia is one of them with respect to refusal to accept federal money for Medicaid.
Well, I think Georgia, and I tried to plead through statements, everything else, to get the governor of Georgia and some of these other governors to accept and expand Medicaid. It doesn't make sense. To me, it's dumb. It doesn't make sense when the federal government is prepared to make millions and billions of dollars available to see that all of our citizens, poor citizens in some of these states, people are dying, hospitals are closing, and they're too proud to accept the resources from the federal government. The government is prepared to fund for many years, and then when those years up, they will still fund it up to 80 to 90%.
Just one last general question before I turn it over to the audience. What advice would you give to the young John Lewises out there, whether they're in rural Alabama or in Atlanta or in Chicago, as to the most effective ways to address whatever injustices they see in the world around them? What path should they take?
I would say to those young would-be John Lewises or whatever, find a way to get in the way.
Find a way to get in the way.
Find a way to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. And be prepared to speak up and speak out. Be bold. Be courageous. You see something that is not right, something that is not fair, that is not just, you have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to get in the way and make some noise. Young people say, how can you be in Congress? You got arrested 40 times during the 60s. And I said, well, since I've been in Congress, I've been arrested 5 more times. And I'm probably going to get arrested again. My last arrest was around comprehensive immigration reform. I wanted the Speaker of the House to bring a bill to the floor. It doesn't make sense for us to have millions of people living in our own country, living in the shadow, living in fear. We're better than that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to turn things to you. If you could raise your hand, I think we have microphones. And if you can wait for the microphone, because we are filming this. Could we have a microphone in the second row, please? And if you just give us your name and a short question. Thank you.
My name's John Blum. I was co-chairman in the 60s for a core chapter in Chicago. I have 2 quick questions for you of stories that went on in that period that I never got the answer to. One of them was there was quite a bit movement to get Reverend King to stop talking about issues outside of this country. Do you remember those periods when the senior executives, Bayard Rustin, Whitney Young, all talked to him and said, stop talking about stuff outside the country? He kept doing it, and of course he won a Nobel Peace Prize in talking about it. Do you remember that, and was that an actual phase?
Well, I do remember that some people in the leadership of the movement, some of the supporters of Dr. King and others, said, don't criticize the president on Vietnam. And Dr. King took the position, I'm not going to segregate my principles. I'm not going to segregate my views. He said, how can we tell people at home to be peaceful, to live by the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence when we engage in violence abroad? I think Dr. King obeyed his conscience and did the right thing.
That it may be apocryphal, but it may be true, and you'll probably know the answer. There was a story that when Kennedy got elected, he decided to have senior executives, Whitney Young, Bayard Rustin, all come into the White House to talk to him. And Whitney Young brought a young man in with him who had been on the front lines, had been beaten up, a young teenager. And they all sat around with all of the fancy accepted people in the black community were there, and they were very careful how they talked to the president. At one point at the end of the conversation, Bobby Kennedy said to this young man who hadn't said a word, what do you think, sir? You've just heard from all of the rest of them. And the kid got up and said, you don't understand what's going on in the real world. You don't understand what's going out in the cities. And at that point, with that young man's expression, the Kennedys understood they had a problem in the country. Is that true, or is that an apocryphal story?
For the most part, that is true. It was during, right after the Freedom Rides in 1961. And I don't want to call the young man's name, but for the most part, that is accurate.
Thank you.
On one occasion, I remember Bobby Kennedy saying to some of us, you have educated me.
In the front row here, as I remember, one of your constituents, I think.
From Atlanta. So,
Good to see you.
Congressman Lewis, you have been a strong supporter of gay and lesbian rights. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to be such a strong supporter of the gay and lesbian community.
Well, growing up and becoming part of the civil rights movement, I saw where certain individuals were being put down because of, not just because of race, but because of sexual orientation. And one, and it's not in a secret, Bayard Rustin was discriminated against. People didn't want Bayard to be the chair of the March on Washington. And it was some of the black leaders. And there was a caucus took place between James Farmer, Martin Luther King, and myself, and said we would select A. Philip Randolph, and Mr. Randolph would pick Bayard as his deputy, and we knew Bayard would put it together. But along the way, I said, you cannot discriminate against people because of sexual orientation. And I heard something that Dr. King said many, many years ago, and I learned a great deal from him. When people would ask him about interracial marriage, he would say, races don't fall in love and get married. Individuals fall in love and get married. So I concluded that if two women or two men fall in love and want to get married, it's their business. No government, federal or state, should be able to tell people who they can fall in love with and get married. And then I also said to myself, sometime as I said, you have to live with your conscience. You have to have an executive session with yourself. I said, I fought too long and too hard against discrimination based on race and color, not to be against discrimination based on sexual orientation. And I don't get any kickback from the people in the district. If you believe in something, you state it. You speak out. You speak out. You cannot have equality for some and not equality for all.
Thank you. Actually, the gentleman there, and then you'll have the next question over here.
Congressman, it's wonderful to have you here. The Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas, has indicated an objection to affirmative action because he is perceived, for example, as having graduated from Yale, but it was a pass. He really didn't deserve to be able to get in there, and he didn't. It wasn't qualified as every other student was. I'm interested in your views on affirmative action in the past and today.
Well, I think in the past, people affirmed the denial of people based on race, based on gender. Affirmative action is affirming the participation, the inclusion of people. And I still think there is a need to affirm the participation of all members of our society, regardless to race, color, or gender. So I believe we still need affirmative action. The scars and stains of racism, sexism is still deeply embedded in American society. We are not there yet. And I know there are people saying, well, we have a colorblind, we're post-racial because we elected a man of color president. But let me tell you, you look at the Congress, we're not there. We're not there.
Over here, if you could wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, this is my uncle here. In 1965, he told me, Marvin Jr., your father said you were a bright son. However, always remember, education cannot be an end to your life, only a means to an end. And I graduated from Colorado State University in 1992 at age 38 and 4 years flat as a pre-law major. And I've lived up here for 18 years. But what I'm asking you is, why does it seem like there is an insistence by corporate America to make it hard for these other young people to get a college education? Because without a college education, you can't make it in this world. Thank you.
Well, we all must continue to insist that all of our young people receive the best possible education. And it doesn't matter whether black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. Education is a great equalizer.
Yes, here in the front row.
Thank you. Mike McLaughlin, Aspen Times. We had some kids from Aspen this past spring go down to Mississippi as part of a program, and they met a bunch of kids that lived in a very segregated area of Mississippi. And the kids that were living in Mississippi understood that they lived in poverty and they lived in a segregated community. You said you wanted these kids to get in the way these days, but what's the voice? Who's the voice these days that these kids will find their inspiration from?
Well, one reason we hope they will read March. Maybe they will be inspired. Maybe they will learn. When I was 17 in 1957, almost 18 in 1958, my birthday is February, there was a comic book called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Story. 14 pages, sold for 10 cents. That book helped me. Andrew would tell you, Dr. King helped edit that little book. People, we need to educate every possible young person that they too can make a contribution. They too can get involved. They can change the condition, change the environment. Show them the films, get them to read the book, the literature. Another generation of young people did it. The children in Birmingham, the children in Selma. They too can do it.
Thank you. Yes, in the back, in the middle, over here.
Mark, thank you, Representative Lewis. I wonder if you could give us some practical advice. I wonder if you would tell us if you think nonviolent means work as well for advancing progress on economic issues as they do on advancing progress on political liberty.
I happen to believe that the way of nonviolence is one of those immutable principles that you cannot deviate from. If you want to have good ends, your means must be good and noble. Somehow, in some way, the end must be caught up in the means. Organize, mobilize at all levels. I believe that.
Thank you. Over here, thank you.
Miltcaster, Florida. Congressman, I really enjoyed it. I know personally to run a 110-acre farm and make a living out of it, you have to be a little intelligent. Tell us more about your parents. Who affected you the most? Your mother, your father? Can you give us some details along those lines?
Well, my parents, my mother and father were really very loving. My father only went to the 6th grade. My mother, the 8th grade. They had 7 boys and 3 girls. 3rd child. We worked very hard, picking cotton, gathering peanuts, growing corn, garden, raising the chickens, some cows, some hogs. But my father was able to take a little and do a great deal with it. I used to complain a great deal as a child. I didn't like working out in the hot sun in the field. And I said from time to time to my mother, I said, this is hard work. This is hard work. And she would say, boy, catch up. Don't fall behind. And she would say, hard work never killed anybody. I said, well, it's about to kill me. But they taught me the dignity of work and responsibility. And if it hadn't been for my mother and my father and so many other wonderful people, I don't know what would have happened to me as a child growing up very poor in rural Alabama.
Yes, the woman right here, and I think this will have to be our last question. Now, we'll please wait for the microphone.
My name is Karen Green. I'm a local teacher. I know that at the March on Washington, you indicated that you had some words to say, but that the elders talked you down from some of those original words. Would you mind closing with that? I think that's just a great story, and it kind of comports with what you said before about get in the way, but maybe there's a way to help young people today, moderating how they actually get in the way, because when you were 23, you had to learn how to do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. See, I didn't want to go there, but you encouraged me to go there. But in 1963, the March on Washington was not in support of a particular piece of civil rights legislation. It was general. In the early part of this prepared speech, I tried to suggest that in good conscience, we could not support the administration proposed civil rights bill. I said it was too little and it was too late. It didn't protect women and children involved in peaceful, nonviolent protests. But then down in this speech, I said, you tell us to wait. You tell us to be patient. We cannot be patient. We cannot wait. We want our freedom and we want it now. And someone said to me, I think this guy was sort of joking, to be exactly about wrestling, said, John, you cannot say that. He said, the Catholic Church believes in being patient, and we have the Archbishop going to give the invocation. And anyway, that poet stayed in the speech. He was just sort of joking, teasing me because he had something else to say. But further down in the speech, I said, we're now involved in a serious revolution. The black masses are restless, and someone didn't want me to use the word revolution. They want me to use black masses. And A. Philip Randolph came to my rescue and said, there's nothing wrong with the use of the word revolution or black masses. I use it myself sometime. Near the end of the speech, I talked about President Kennedy, and I had talked about Republicans and Democrats and moral compromises and all of that. Near the end of the speech, I played on some words. I said, if we do not see meaningful progress here today, the day may come when we will not confine our marching on Washington, but we may be forced to march through the South the way Sherman did, nonviolently. And they said, oh, John, you can't go there. You can't say that. So the music had started, and the program was underway. We were still trying to negotiate what I was going to delete or not. So we got on the side of Mr. Lincoln there, and we started working on making the changes. And Mr. Randolph said, John, we come this far together. Can we just stay together? Can you delete that portion? And then Dr. King said, John, that doesn't sound like you. Can you change that? And I couldn't say no to A. Philip Randolph, this prince of a man. And I couldn't say no to Martin Luther King Jr., my hero and a man I admired and loved. And so I made the changes. And I just said something like, if we do not see meaningful progress here today, we're going to march through certain cities like Birmingham, Jackson, Mississippi, Harlem, or Philadelphia. And I just named some cities. But it came off okay.
It sure did. Now, I just have a question. Chris, the books are going to be available where? Just over here? So I recommend all of you think about it for yourself, your children, your grandchildren. It's a wonderful book. John Lewis, it's been a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.